I need to correct something. I think I've been getting subtly wrong across a lot of popular discussion of dopamine, including some of my own past framing. The common story goes something like this. Dopamine is the pleasure chemical. And if you can't stay motivated, it's because your dopamine system is somehow depleted, fried by too much social media, too much junk food, too much instant gratification, and the fix is some version of a dopamine detox, abstaining from stimulating activities to let your levels reset. I want to walk you through why this entire framing, while pointing at something real, gets the actual neuroscience backward in a way that matters enormously for what you should actually do if you're struggling with motivation. Dopamine isn't primarily about pleasure. It's about prediction and the gap between what you expect and what actually happens. And once you understand that distinction, the whole conversation about motivation, procrastination, and why certain habits feel impossible to break starts to make a lot more sense. Let's start with where the pleasure framing actually came from, because I think understanding its origin helps explain why it became so popular despite being incomplete. Early research on dopamine, dating back to experiments in the 1950s and continuing through subsequent decades, found that stimulating dopamine-related brain regions in animals produced behavior that looked a lot like pleasure-seeking. Animals would repeatedly press a lever to trigger stimulation of these pathways, sometimes to the point of neglecting food and water, which led researchers to conclude dopamine was essentially the brain's pleasure or reward chemical citation. This foundational research on dopamine and what was initially interpreted as a pleasure or reward system was established through decades of neuroscience research, including foundational work by Olds and Milner in the 1950s, published in journals including the Journal of Comparative and Physiological Psychology, and subsequent research building on these initial findings. For decades, this pleasure interpretation dominated both scientific and popular understanding of dopamine's function. The correction came from a genuinely elegant series of experiments conducted primarily by neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz and colleagues using single neuron recording in primates to track dopamine neuron activity in real time during learning tasks. What they found fundamentally changed how neuroscience understands this system. When an animal received an unexpected reward, dopamine neurons fired robustly. But as the animal learned to predict that reward, learning that a specific cue reliably preceded it, the dopamine response shifted. It stopped firing at the moment of reward delivery and instead started firing at the moment the predictive cue appeared before the reward itself arrived. Citation. This landmark research demonstrating that dopamine neuron firing shifts from the reward itself to the predictive cue as learning occurs was established by Schultz and colleagues, published extensively in journals including Science and the Journal of Neuroscience, and has become foundational to modern understanding of dopamine's actual function. And here's the part that I think most directly overturns the simple pleasure narrative. If the reward was then predicted but failed to arrive, dopamine neurons showed a pronounced dip below their baseline firing rate, precisely at the moment the reward was expected but didn't materialize. This pattern, robust firing to unexpected reward, a shift toward firing at the predictive cue as learning occurs, and a dip below baseline when an expected reward fails to appear, is the signature of what's now called reward prediction error, and it's the foundation of modern dopamine neuroscience. Dopamine isn't tracking pleasure itself, it's tracking the difference between what you expected and what actually happened. Citation, this reward prediction error framework, now foundational to computational and systems neuroscience models of dopamine function, has been extensively validated and elaborated in subsequent research published in journals including Nature, Neuroscience, and Neuron. When reality exceeds expectation, you get a dopamine spike. When reality matches expectation, you get essentially no dopamine response, even if the outcome itself is genuinely pleasurable. And when reality falls short of expectation, you get a dip below baseline, which is experienced subjectively as disappointment, regardless of how objectively good the outcome might have been on its own terms. I want to sit with the implications of this for a moment, because I think this is genuinely the piece that reframes the entire motivation conversation. If dopamine tracked pleasure directly, then repeating a pleasurable experience should keep producing a strong dopamine response every time, since the pleasure itself hasn't changed. But that's not what happens. Once an outcome becomes predictable, the dopamine response to the outcome itself largely disappears, regardless of how pleasurable that outcome remains on a purely hedonic level. This is why a favorite meal, a favorite song, a favorite show, all things you can still genuinely enjoy, stop producing the same charge of anticipatory excitement they once did, not because the underlying pleasure has diminished, but because your brain has learned to predict them accurately. And prediction, not pleasure, is what dopamine actually responds to. This directly explains something that I think most people have experienced but never quite understood mechanistically: the gap between wanting and liking. Neuroscientist Kent Berridge and colleagues have done extensive work distinguishing these two systems, specifically finding that the neural circuitry underlying wanting, the motivational pull toward pursuing something, and liking, the actual hedonic pleasure experienced once you have it, are genuinely separable. And dopamine appears far more centrally involved in the wanting system than in the liking system itself. Citation: this distinction between wanting and liking as separable neural systems, with dopamine more centrally involved in wanting specifically, has been established through extensive research by Berridge and Robinson, published in journals including Psychological Review and Trends in Neurosciences. Some of the most striking evidence for this comes from research where animals had their dopamine systems pharmacologically blocked entirely. These animals showed no diminished facial expressions of pleasure when given a rewarding taste, meaning the liking response remained fully intact, but they showed dramatically reduced motivation to actually seek out and work for that same reward. Citation: this dissociation between preserved liking responses and dramatically reduced wanting or motivated pursuit following dopamine blockade has been demonstrated in research by Berridge and colleagues published in the journal Neuroscience. This is genuinely one of the more important, underappreciated distinctions in this entire field, and I think it directly explains a huge amount of what people experience as a motivation problem. You can absolutely still like something, still find it genuinely pleasurable when you're actually engaged in it, while simultaneously experiencing a profound deficit in the wanting system that's supposed to actually get you off the couch and moving toward it in the first place. This is a completely different problem than a pleasure deficit, and it requires a completely different solution than simply seeking out more pleasurable experiences or abstaining from stimulation to let some depleted pleasure reservoir refill. Let me bring in variable reward schedules now, because I think this connects directly to why certain modern technologies and habits feel so uniquely difficult to disengage from. And it ties back precisely to the prediction error framework we just established. Research on reinforcement schedules, dating back to foundational behavioral psychology research by B.F. Skinner, found that variable, unpredictable reward schedules, where you don't know exactly when or whether a given action will produce a reward, produce considerably more persistent, harder to extinguish behavior than fixed, predictable reward schedules. Even when the fixed schedule delivers rewards more frequently overall, citation, this foundational behavioral research on variable ratio reinforcement schedules and their persistence generating effects was established by B.F. Skinner and subsequent behavioral psychology research, and has been extensively integrated into modern neuroscience research on dopamine and reward prediction. This makes complete sense once you understand dopamine as a prediction error signal rather than a pleasure signal specifically. A completely predictable reward stops generating meaningful dopamine response once it's learned, but a variable, unpredictable reward never becomes fully predictable, meaning it continues generating meaningful prediction error and therefore meaningful dopamine response indefinitely every single time, precisely because you genuinely don't know in advance whether this particular instance will pay off. I want to connect this directly to the design of a lot of modern technology, since I think this is genuinely relevant, well documented, and directly explains a pattern most people have experienced firsthand. Social media platforms, in particular the mechanics of pulling to refresh a feed or checking for notifications, operate on precisely this kind of variable reward structure. You genuinely don't know in advance whether this particular check will produce something genuinely interesting or rewarding. And researchers and former technology industry insiders have specifically discussed how this variable reward mechanic, deliberately or otherwise, mirrors the exact conditions known from decades of behavioral psychology and dopamine research to produce maximally persistent, compulsive feeling engagement, citation, this application of variable reward schedule principles to technology and social media platform design has been discussed extensively in behavioral science and technology ethics literature, including analysis published in journals covering behavioral addiction and discussed by researchers and former industry professionals examining platform design mechanics. I want to be careful here about not overstating clinical addiction claims, since formal behavioral addiction diagnosis is a genuinely more complex clinical matter than simply describing a mechanism. But the underlying mechanistic principle, variable reward schedules producing unusually persistent engagement through sustained prediction error and dopamine signaling, rather than through simple pleasure, is genuinely well established. Now let's get to the part of this conversation I think matters most directly for the motivation problem specifically, because I think this is where the reframing away from pleasure and toward prediction becomes genuinely practically important. If dopamine's core function is tracking prediction error, then a persistent feeling of low motivation isn't necessarily a sign that your dopamine system is depleted or damaged in some general sense. It may reflect something more specific, an environment or a set of goals structured in a way that isn't generating meaningful prediction error in the first place. Let me explain what I mean by this concretely. Tasks that are either too predictable, you already know exactly how they'll go and exactly what the outcome will be, or too uncertain in a way that offers no meaningful feedback about whether you're making progress, tend to generate remarkably little dopamine signal, and by extension, remarkably little subjective motivation, regardless of how objectively important or valuable that task actually is. This is a genuinely important reframing of what a lot of people experience as procrastination or lack of discipline around important, meaningful, long-term goals, working toward a distant goal, finishing a dissertation, building a business, getting into better physical shape over the course of a year, often lacks the kind of frequent, meaningful prediction error signal that more immediately structured activities. A video game with clear levels and immediate feedback, a notification-driven app naturally provide. It's not that you don't care about the distant goal. It's that the way you've structured your engagement with it may simply not be generating the moment-to-moment neural signal that sustained motivation actually depends on. This connects to a body of research and practical application specifically examining goal setting and its relationship to sustained motivation. Research on goal-setting theory has consistently found that specific proximal goals with clear, frequent feedback produce considerably better sustained engagement and performance than vague, distant goals alone, even when the distant goal represents the genuine, ultimate objective. Citation, this goal-setting research, and the specific advantage of proximal, feedback-rich goals over distant, vague goals for sustaining motivation has been established extensively through decades of research led by Edwin Locke and Gary Latham, published in journals including the American Psychologist and summarized across numerous subsequent meta-analyses. What I think this research is really capturing, viewed through the dopamine and prediction error lens we've established throughout this video, is that breaking a distant goal into smaller, frequently achievable milestones creates considerably more opportunity for the kind of prediction error signal, did I hit this specific near-term target or not, that actually drives the neural motivation system compared to a single, distant, difficult to track objective that offers essentially no meaningful feedback signal for months or years at a time. Let me bring in something about uncertainty and effort here as well, since I think this adds a genuinely important additional layer to this conversation. Research examining dopamine's role, specifically in effort-based decision-making, not just simple reward prediction, has found that dopamine signaling also appears involved in calculating whether a given amount of effort is worth investing relative to the expected uncertain payoff, essentially functioning as part of a cost-benefit calculation system, weighing effort against probable reward. Citation, this research on dopamine's role in effort-based decision-making and cost-benefit calculation, distinct from simple reward prediction alone, has been examined extensively by researchers, including John Salamone, published in journals including Neuron and the Journal of Neuroscience. This is genuinely important because it suggests that chronic prolonged uncertainty about whether effort will actually pay off, a genuinely common experience for anyone pursuing an ambiguous, long-term goal without clear feedback, may itself contribute to reduced motivation, not through some kind of generalized dopamine depletion, but through the system genuinely functionally calculating that the expected value of continued effort, given persistent uncertainty about payoff, doesn't clearly justify the cost. Let me address the popular dopamine detox concept directly now, since I think it deserves honest, direct examination given everything we've covered so far. The core premise behind dopamine detoxing, that engaging in highly stimulating activities depletes some finite reservoir of dopamine, leaving you with less available for other, less immediately stimulating pursuits, doesn't actually match the prediction error framework we've spent this entire video establishing. Dopamine isn't stored in some depletable reservoir that gets used up through stimulating experiences and needs time to passively refill. It's released dynamically in response to prediction error, moment to moment, based on the specific structure of whatever activity or environment you're currently engaged with. That said, I don't want to entirely dismiss everything that gets bundled under the dopamine detox umbrella, because I think there's a genuinely real phenomenon getting captured imprecisely by an inaccurate mechanistic explanation. Here's what I think is actually happening. When someone reports feeling more motivated toward previously unappealing, effortful tasks after a period of abstaining from highly stimulating, variable reward activities like social media or video games, it's not that dopamine itself was depleted and needed to refill. It's more likely that repeated exposure to activities generating frequent, strong prediction error signals, the variable reward mechanics we discussed earlier, recalibrates your relative expectations, making genuinely slower, more effortful, less immediately feedback-rich activities feel comparatively even less rewarding by direct contrast, essentially a shift in relative reference point rather than an absolute depletion of some finite neurochemical resource citation needed for a fully established, mechanistically precise account of exactly how repeated high-frequency prediction error exposure specifically recalibrates comparative reward expectations for other lower stimulation activities. Since this represents a genuinely plausible extrapolation from the core reward prediction error research, rather than a single, definitively established study directly testing this specific recalibration mechanism in isolation, though it's consistent with the broader principles established throughout the research we've discussed in this video. I think this distinction matters enormously for what you should actually do about it. If you believe the depletion model, dopamine has to run out before it can refill, the natural response is complete abstinence for some period, waiting passively for levels to reset. If instead the actual mechanism involves comparative recalibration of expectation, then the more useful, evidence-consistent approach isn't necessarily complete abstinence. It's deliberately restructuring your effortful, important tasks to include more frequent points of genuine, meaningful feedback and small, achievable wins, closing the gap between how quickly stimulating variable reward activities deliver prediction error signals and how infrequently your important, longer-term goals currently do. Let me talk about how this applies concretely to specific common motivation struggles, because I think this is where the entire theoretical framework we've built throughout this video becomes genuinely useful rather than remaining purely abstract. Consider exercise specifically, something we've discussed extensively throughout other videos on this channel from a purely physiological standpoint. A huge number of people struggle to maintain a consistent exercise habit, and the popular dopamine is depleted framing would suggest the solution is somehow restoring baseline dopamine function through abstinence from other stimulating activities. The prediction error framework suggests something different, and I think considerably more actionable, structuring your training in a way that provides frequent, trackable, meaningful feedback, visible progress on a specific lift, a completed streak of consistent sessions, a measurable improvement on one of the functional tests we've discussed throughout our longevity series, creates considerably more opportunity for genuine prediction error signal and therefore genuine dopamine-driven motivation than an approach where progress feels vague, slow, and difficult to perceive week to week. This connects directly to something we discussed in a previous video on habit formation implicitly without fully naming the underlying mechanism. The value of tracking small, measurable wins isn't simply a psychological trick or a matter of willpower. It's directly leveraging the actual well-established neurobiology of how the dopamine system generates motivation in the first place through prediction error signal, not through raw pleasure or willpower reserves. Let me address something about video games specifically here, since I think they offer a genuinely useful, almost laboratory clean illustration of everything we've discussed throughout this video. Well-designed video games are often explicitly, deliberately structured around exactly the principles that maximize prediction error and sustained engagement. Frequent, clear feedback on progress, achievements and levels that arrive at a carefully calibrated, unpredictable enough pace, and a continuous stream of small, trackable wins layered underneath larger, longer-term objectives. Citation: this application of reward prediction error and variable reward principles to video game design has been discussed extensively in the game design and behavioral psychology literature, examining player engagement and motivation. Mechanics. I don't say this to demonize video games specifically. They're a genuinely useful illustration of a broader principle. Activities specifically engineered around frequent, well-calibrated feedback loops will nearly always feel more motivating in the moment than activities that lack this structure. Regardless of the actual long-term importance or value of either activity, which is precisely why it's so common to feel more consistently drawn toward a game than toward a genuinely more important but more poorly structured long-term personal or professional goal. I want to bring in something about depression and anhedonia here as well, since I think dopamine's actual role in this condition connects directly to, and further clarifies, the distinction between wanting and liking we established earlier in this video. Anhedonia, the reduced capacity to experience pleasure, is a well-known symptom of clinical depression, but research has increasingly found that a considerable portion of what gets described clinically as anhedonia in depression may actually reflect reduced motivational drive, reduced wanting specifically, rather than a genuine reduction in the capacity to experience pleasure once actually engaged in an activity. Citation: this research distinguishing motivational deficits, reduced wanting from genuine hedonic capacity deficits, reduced liking within the broader symptom of anhedonia and clinical depression has been examined in psychiatric neuroscience research published in journals including Biological Psychiatry and the American Journal of Psychiatry. This is genuinely clinically important because it suggests that a considerable amount of what depressed individuals experience isn't necessarily that formerly enjoyable activities no longer feel good once they're actually doing them. It's that the motivational pull to initiate and pursue those activities in the first place has been specifically and disproportionately affected, precisely the dopamine-mediated wanting system we discussed earlier, distinct from the liking system that may remain considerably more intact than the initial purely pleasure-based framing of anhedonia would suggest. I want to be genuinely careful here, since I don't want anything in this video to be read as offering a simplified explanation for or treatment approach to clinical depression, which is a genuinely serious condition requiring proper clinical evaluation and treatment. And this specific research represents one mechanistic piece of a considerably more complex clinical picture, not a complete explanation or a self-treatment framework. But I think understanding this distinction, wanting versus liking, prediction error versus pleasure, genuinely helps make sense of why depressed individuals often describe struggling to initiate activities that, once actually underway, they can still recognize as genuinely enjoyable in the moment, a pattern that makes considerably more sense through the neuroscience we've discussed throughout this entire video than it does through a simple, undifferentiated, pleasure is gone framing. Let me bring in something about dopamine and addiction here as well, since I think it's directly relevant to correcting the popular understanding this video has been built around throughout. Research on addiction has found that repeated exposure to highly reinforcing substances or behaviors appears to produce genuine, measurable changes in dopamine signaling over time, but these changes aren't simply a matter of pleasure diminishing through repeated exposure. They specifically involve changes in the prediction error and incentive salient systems we've discussed throughout this video, meaning addiction appears to involve a progressive strengthening of the wanting system specifically directed toward the addictive substance or behavior, often occurring alongside a genuine decline in liking, the actual hedonic pleasure experience from the substance itself. Citation, this research on addiction, specifically involving a dissociation between increasingly powerful wanting and progressively diminished liking, has been established extensively through the incentive sensitization theory of addiction, developed by Robinson and Berridge, published in journals including Brain Research Reviews and Addiction. This is genuinely one of the more striking, counterintuitive findings in this entire body of research. Addiction specifically involves the wanting system becoming progressively more powerful and dominant over time, even as the actual pleasure derived from the substance itself often genuinely diminishes, which is precisely why someone deep into an addiction can accurately, honestly report that the substance no longer produces much genuine pleasure, while simultaneously experiencing an overwhelming compulsive pull toward continuing to seek it out. Let me bring this entire considerably long conversation together now into what I actually want you to walk away with. Dopamine is not primarily the brain's pleasure chemical. It's a prediction error signal, tracking the gap between what you expect and what actually happens. And it's more centrally involved in the wanting system, the motivational drive to pursue something, than in the liking system, the actual hedonic experience of having it. This explains why previously enjoyable experiences stop feeling as exciting once they become fully predictable, why variable, unpredictable reward schedules produce uniquely persistent, hard-to-resist engagement, why distant, vaguely defined goals often struggle to sustain motivation compared to goals broken into frequent, trackable milestones, and why the popular dopamine detox framework, built around a depletable reservoir model that doesn't match the actual neuroscience, may still capture a real underlying phenomenon, comparative recalibration of expectation, poorly explained through an inaccurate mechanistic story. If there's one thing I want you to take from this entire correction, it's this. If you're struggling to stay motivated towards something you genuinely care about, the problem very likely isn't a depleted, damaged dopamine system that needs to passively rest and recover. It's far more likely that the way you've currently structured your engagement with that goal isn't generating the kind of frequent, meaningful prediction error signal that sustained motivation actually depends on. The fix isn't abstinence and waiting. It's deliberately restructuring your important, effortful goals to include more frequent points of genuine, trackable feedback, breaking distant objectives into smaller, achievable milestones, and being honest with yourself about the genuine gap between how quickly and predictably other parts of your life deliver that same kind of signal. Let me add several more layers to this conversation, because there's considerably more depth here worth covering properly. I want to go deeper into the actual neuroanatomy involved, because I think naming the specific structures makes this considerably more concrete than treating dopamine as some vague, undifferentiated substance floating around the brain. The dopamine neurons most centrally involved in reward prediction error originate primarily in two closely related midbrain structures, the ventral tegmental area and the substantia nigra, and project outward along distinct pathways to different target regions, with the mesolimbic pathway projecting to the nucleus accumbens, being most centrally implicated in reward-related motivation and the wanting system we discussed earlier, while the mesocortical pathway, projecting to the prefrontal cortex, appears more involved in using that reward signal to guide planning, decision-making, and goal-directed behavior over time. Citation: this anatomical distinction between mesolimbic and mesocortical dopamine pathways and their somewhat distinct functional roles in reward processing versus goal-directed planning is well established in foundational neuroscience literature on the dopamine system, described extensively in textbooks and review articles published in journals including Annual Review of Neuroscience. This matters because it helps explain why dopamine dysfunction can manifest in genuinely different ways depending on which specific pathway is more affected. Purely motivational deficits versus difficulties, translating motivation into sustained, organized pursuit of longer-term goals, which are related but distinguishable problems. Let me bring in something about the nucleus accumbens specifically, since it's come up repeatedly in the research I've cited throughout this video without much direct explanation of what it actually does. The nucleus accumbens functions as a genuinely critical integration hub, receiving dopamine input from the ventral tegmental area alongside information from other brain regions involved in memory, emotional processing, and executive planning, and research has found it to be centrally involved in translating a reward prediction error signal into actual motivated action, essentially serving as a kind of interface between here's a signal indicating something better or worse than expected just happened, and here's how much effort and attention you should now allocate toward pursuing or avoiding whatever produced that signal, citation. This integrative role of the nucleus accumbens in translating dopaminergic prediction error signals into motivated behavioral output has been examined extensively in research published in journals including Nature Reviews, Neuroscience. I think understanding this specific structure's role helps make the whole system feel less abstract. When I've talked throughout this video about dopamine driving motivation, this is genuinely the specific anatomical location where that translation from abstract signal into actual behavioral drive is understood occur most directly. I want to spend real time now on something I only briefly touched on earlier, the specific relationship between dopamine and working memory and cognitive flexibility, since I think this adds a genuinely important additional dimension to the motivation conversation that goes beyond simple reward-seeking behavior. Research examining dopamine's role in prefrontal cortex function has found that dopamine signaling appears to play a meaningful role in working memory capacity and cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold information in mind and flexibly shift between different mental tasks or strategies with both too little and too much dopamine signaling in this specific region associated with impaired performance, following what researchers describe as an inverted U-shaped relationship, citation, this inverted U-shaped relationship between prefrontal dopamine signaling and cognitive performance, including working memory and cognitive flexibility, has been established extensively in research published in journals including Trends in Neurosciences and Nature Reviews Neuroscience. This connects to something worth mentioning here. This specific relationship is part of why stimulant medications used to treat ADHD, which affect dopamine signaling among other neurotransmitter systems, can improve focus and cognitive performance in individuals with genuinely low baseline dopaminergic tone in this specific circuit, while potentially impairing performance in individuals whose baseline tone is already optimal, a pattern we touched on briefly in a previous video discussing stimulant medications more broadly. Let me address something about dopamine and habit formation more directly here, since I think this connects usefully to practical behavior change in a way I haven't fully addressed yet. Research distinguishes between goal-directed behavior, actions performed because you consciously value their specific outcome, and habitual behavior, actions performed more automatically, triggered by contextual cues with less ongoing conscious deliberation about the specific outcome. And research suggests that as behaviors become genuinely habitual through repetition, the neural circuitry involved shifts somewhat from more prefrontal goal-directed circuits toward more automatic dorsal striatal circuits, with dopamine playing a role in this transition specifically by reinforcing the specific action context associations that eventually become habit, citation. This shift from goal-directed to habitual neural circuitry with repeated behavior and dopamine's role in reinforcing the underlying action context associations has been examined extensively in research published in journals including Nature Reviews, Neuroscience, and Neuron, including foundational work by researchers including Barbara Sahakian and Trevor Robbins on habit formation neuroscience. This is genuinely useful practical context. It suggests that the prediction error-rich, effortful early stages of building a new positive habit, when you genuinely need frequent feedback and trackable wins to sustain motivation, given everything we discussed earlier in this video, eventually transitions toward a state where the behavior requires considerably less active moment-to-moment motivational drive at all, since it's become genuinely automatic and cue-triggered rather than requiring the same ongoing prediction error-driven push that was necessary during the initial learning phase. I want to bring in something about dopamine and social reward specifically here, since I think this is a genuinely underappreciated application of everything we've discussed throughout this video and connects directly to the social media conversation from earlier. Research has found that social rewards, positive social feedback, approval, likes, comments, engage the same fundamental dopaminergic reward prediction error circuitry that we've discussed throughout this entire video in the context of other rewards, meaning the neuroscience underlying why social validation feels motivating and why unpredictable social feedback specifically feels so compelling, operates through essentially the same mechanism as everything else we've covered. Citation. This research demonstrating that social rewards engage the same core dopaminergic reward prediction error circuitry as other reward types has been examined in social neuroscience research published in journals including Neuron and Social, Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience. This directly reinforces why social media specifically, combining both variable reward timing and inherently unpredictable social feedback, represents what's essentially a maximally optimized activation of this entire system. Two distinct sources of prediction error generating uncertainty layered on top of each other simultaneously. Let me address something about exercise's specific relationship to dopamine here as well. Connecting to broader physical training content we've covered extensively elsewhere on this channel, research has found that regular exercise appears to produce genuine, measurable changes in dopamine system function over time, including some research suggesting improved dopamine receptor sensitivity and more favorable baseline dopaminergic tone in individuals who exercise consistently compared to sedentary individuals. Citation. This research on exercise's effects on dopamine receptor sensitivity and baseline dopaminergic function has been examined in exercise neuroscience research published in journals including the Journal of Neuroscience and Progress, Neurobiology. I think this adds a genuinely interesting additional layer to why consistent exercise appears to support not just physical health, as we've covered extensively in previous videos, but also seems to support improved baseline motivation and mood more broadly. It may be genuinely directly influencing the sensitivity and function of the very system we've spent this entire video discussing, beyond simply the mood benefits mediated through other pathways we've referenced in earlier content on this channel. I want to spend time now on something related to novelty specifically, since I think it deserves more direct treatment given how much it's implicitly threaded throughout everything we've discussed. Research has found that genuine novelty itself, independent of whether an outcome is explicitly rewarding, appears to activate dopamine signaling, with novel stimuli and environments producing dopamine responses similar in some respects to unpredicted reward, even before any actual reward has been delivered or confirmed. Citation. This research on novelty itself as a dopamine activating stimulus, independent of confirmed reward, has been examined in neuroscience research published in journals including Neuron and Nature Neuroscience, sometimes discussed under the framework of novelty as an inherently rewarding or reward predicting signal in its own right. This helps explain a pattern a lot of people recognize intuitively. Starting something new, a new hobby, a new relationship, a new project, often feels considerably more motivating and exciting than continuing with something familiar, even when the familiar activity is objectively just as valuable or enjoyable, simply because novelty itself appears to be a genuine, independent trigger for the dopaminergic signaling we've discussed throughout this entire video, entirely separate from the specific content or value of whatever is novel. Let me bring in something about sleep and dopamine here as well, connecting to sleep-focused content we've covered extensively elsewhere on this channel. Research has found that sleep deprivation produces measurable disruptions to dopamine system function, including some research finding altered dopamine receptor availability and altered reward-related brain activity following sleep restriction, which may help explain why chronic sleep deprivation is so consistently associated with reduced motivation, increased impulsivity around immediately available rewards, and, in some research, increased susceptibility to compulsive or addictive behavior patterns. Citation. This research on sleep deprivation's effects on dopamine receptor availability and reward-related brain function has been examined in sleep neuroscience research published in journals, including the Journal of Neuroscience and sleep medicine reviews. This connects directly to a theme that's run throughout essentially every video on this entire channel. The various pillars we discuss: sleep, exercise, nutrition, don't operate as separate, disconnected silos. They converge on shared underlying neurobiological systems, and the dopamine and motivation system we've spent this entire video discussing appears to be genuinely directly affected by whether you're getting adequate sleep, independent of and alongside everything else we've covered. I want to address something about the specific relationship between chronic stress and dopamine function here as well, since I think it adds a genuinely important additional dimension. Research examining chronic stress and dopamine signaling has found complex, somewhat bidirectional effects, with acute stress generally producing increased dopamine release in certain pathways, while chronic prolonged stress has been associated in some research with blunted dopaminergic responsiveness over time, potentially contributing to the reduced motivation and anhedonia-like symptoms commonly associated with chronic stress and burnout. Citation: this research on the complex time-dependent relationship between stress exposure and dopamine system function, including blunted responsiveness following chronic stress specifically, has been examined in psychoneuroendocrinology research published in journals including neuropsychopharmacology and biological psychiatry. This offers a genuinely useful, additional mechanistic explanation for a pattern a lot of people experience during periods of prolonged chronic stress or burnout, a genuine, measurable blunting of the system that normally generates motivation and drive, which helps explain why simply telling yourself to push through and try harder often proves considerably less effective during a genuine period of chronic stress than it would under normal circumstances. Since the underlying neurochemical system responsible for generating that motivational push may itself be genuinely, measurably compromised during such periods. Let me talk about caffeine's relationship to dopamine here as well, since it's an extremely commonly used substance relevant to this entire conversation. Caffeine doesn't directly increase dopamine release the way some other substances do. Its primary mechanism involves blocking adenosine receptors, adenosine being a neurotransmitter that generally has an inhibitory, sedating effect on neural activity. But by blocking this inhibitory signal, caffeine indirectly enhances the effects of dopamine signaling that's already occurring, essentially amplifying existing dopaminergic activity rather than generating new dopamine release directly. Citation: this mechanism of caffeine's indirect enhancement of dopaminergic signaling through adenosine receptor blockade has been examined in pharmacological neuroscience research published in journals including Pharmacological Reviews and the Journal of Neuroscience. This is genuinely useful, precise context for anyone who relies on caffeine specifically to feel more motivated or focused. It's not simply generating a raw dopamine surge from nothing. It's amplifying whatever dopaminergic activity is already present in a given context, which may partly explain why caffeine's motivational and cognitive benefits can feel considerably more pronounced in genuinely engaging, appropriately stimulating contexts compared to genuinely dull, unstimulating ones, since there's simply more existing dopaminergic signal available to amplify in the former case. I want to bring in something about the specific timing of dopamine release relative to effort itself here, since I think this deserves a bit more nuance than I've given it so far. Beyond the simple prediction error at reward delivery framework we established early in this video, more recent research has found that dopamine also appears to play a role during the actual pursuit of a goal, not just at the moment of prediction or reward delivery, with some research finding that dopamine levels ramp up gradually as an animal approaches an anticipated reward, functioning almost like a real-time signal of increasing proximity or increasing confidence in eventual success. Citation: this research on dopamine ramping during active goal pursuit, functioning as a real-time signal of proximity to an anticipated reward, has been examined in more recent neuroscience research published in journals including Nature and Current Biology, building on and extending the classic reward prediction error framework we established earlier in this video. This adds a genuinely useful additional practical dimension. It suggests that visible, tangible signals of increasing proximity to a goal, a progress bar, a visible countdown, a clearly marked sense of I'm getting closer, may themselves be directly, mechanistically supporting sustained motivation throughout an effortful pursuit, not just the final achievement of the goal itself, which offers additional concrete justification for structuring long-term goals with visible intermediate progress markers beyond simply the milestone-based feedback we discussed earlier. Let me bring this considerably expanded, thorough conversation to its actual close now. Everything we've added in this deeper exploration, the specific anatomical pathways and structures involved, dopamine's role in working memory and cognitive flexibility beyond pure reward seeking, the transition from goal-directed to habitual neural circuitry as behaviors become automatic, social rewards engagement of this same core system exercises genuine effects on dopamine receptor sensitivity, novelty as an independent trigger for dopaminergic signaling, sleep deprivations, measurable disruption of this system, chronic stresses blunting effects that help explain burnout-related motivation loss, caffeine's actual amplifying rather than generating mechanism, and dopamine's role during active goal pursuit itself, not just at the moment of reward. All of it reinforces and deepens the central correction this entire video has been built around. Dopamine is not a simple pleasure chemical that gets depleted through overstimulation and needs passive rest to recover. It's a sophisticated, prediction-based signaling system involved in motivation, learning, habit formation, cognitive function, and goal pursuit that responds dynamically to how your environment and your own self-structured goals are organized moment to moment. And understanding this system accurately, rather than through the popularized but inaccurate pleasure depletion story, gives you a considerably more precise, considerably more actionable set of tools for actually addressing genuine motivation struggles, whether that means restructuring a long-term goal with more frequent feedback, protecting your sleep, managing chronic stress, or simply being honest about why a poorly structured task will always struggle to compete against something deliberately engineered around the exact mechanics that sustain engagement most powerfully. This video discusses general neuroscience and psychology research for informational and educational purposes only, and does not constitute personalized medical or mental health advice. If you're experiencing persistent, significant difficulty with motivation that's affecting your daily functioning, particularly if accompanied by other symptoms like persistent low mood, please consider reaching out to a qualified mental health professional who can provide proper assessment and support beyond what general educational content like this can offer.